Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Bestie, and I think I will start us off because we are running a little late. But please feel free to get as many snacks as you'd like and enjoy this happy hour. Thank you so much for coming. I know that this is our busiest time of the semester, and it was the one time I could get Dr. Kristin Heyer here, so I really appreciate you coming. I just want to acknowledge that I express some gratitude to Babs and David Coach, who created and funded the Coach Chair in Catholic Thought and Culture. And they did this to provide opportunities for faculty, staff, and students to really examine the Catholic tradition and its relevance to contemporary social issues. And it's really exciting for me to introduce Dr. Kristin Heyer to you because out of everyone in the United States of America, she is the person I most wanted as my first choice to address our community on the common good because she really understands the complexities and the challenges of the common good that are being raised by a lot of amazing theorists. Because the common good in the Catholic tradition can be used in ways that represent a dominant class and a dominant thinking of what constitutes the common good. And so Kristin is well-versed not only in Catholic social tradition, but also in social cultural theory, theorists, philosophy. And so she's just phenomenal. So I would just love to briefly tell you a little bit about Kristin. She has really dedicated her career to Catholic social thought, immigration, moral agency, the whole concept of social sin, social justice, and that doesn't really do justice to what Kristin has done, but she has edited 5 books, and her own books include Kinship Across Borders, A Christian Ethic of Immigration, and a book, Prophetic and Public, The Social Witness of U.S. Catholicism. And this won the College Theology Society's Best Book Award. And she's also contributed to all theological ethical journals. She also serves as co-chair of a planning committee for Catholic theological ethics in the World Church, which has brought together Catholic ethicists from all over the world, from the global south, from everywhere. And I was privileged to be at one of those conferences, which was phenomenal. So trying to get Catholic ethicists to be working together globally on issues. She's also vice president of Catholic Theological Society of America. But overall, she has been really active at Boston College and elsewhere on integrating the common good and difference diversity concerns. So Kristin, thank you so much for being willing to be here. And this is gonna be really fun because we have an intimate group. And so Kristin's gonna just present some thoughts and we're gonna have a lot of discussion. So maybe we can all join 2 or 3 tables and just have a fun happy hour. So please enjoy.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. It's great to be back at the College of St. Ben's. I think in 20 years, it's my first happy hour presentation. So I think it'll be better and better the more trips that you take to the back of the room. If it doesn't take too long, it would really help me just to know what departments or disciplines folks are here from. Could we just take a quick name and discipline trip around the room? Ben, can you start?
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm in theology.
Great.
Dale Lauderdale, Scripture.
Bernie Gross, Maryland Studies.
Nicholas Becker, Theology.
I'm Scott Johnson. I'm a political theorist and political science.
John Wright, Philosophy.
Laura Taylor, Theology. Gary Shane, Theology.
Chris Conway, Theology.
Jean Carter, Philosophy and Gender Studies.
Carol Brash, art, and Asian studies.
Asian studies, gender studies.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. I know it's the last week of classes here. So like Jennifer said, I just would like to share a few ideas about the common good. I understand it's now part of the learning goals in your new integrated curriculum, but then prioritize some time for maybe conversations about how it applies to your context here. So yeah, I want to also echo what Jennifer said from the outset. I've worked at 3 different Jesuit universities over the course of my career. I'm a social ethicist, so the common good has often animated my own work, but I've also worked with many colleagues for whom the common good signals fascism, not to put too fine a point on it. So I know that the ways that concept has operated over the many years, I know that institutionalization of the common good has not always been inclusive. So I wanted just to be frank about both elements of the tradition, maybe its value and some of its limitations or growing edges. I don't think I've ever thought about that as a euphemism, but I definitely use growing edges when I mean shortcomings. So we'll talk about some growing edges this afternoon. Okay, so as you likely know, the concept of the common good has deep historical roots in traditions of Western thought. Classical Greek philosophy shaped a vision of the good life, with Aristotle arguing that the good of the community should guide individuals' lives, and articulating the pursuit of the general welfare of the polis in a context of participatory self-governance. Then, as you also likely know, Augustine and Aquinas built upon this understanding that the relationship to God requires commitment to the common good of our neighbors as well as all creation. So I think today we can readily think about goods that we can only know in common as we face shared threats like global warming or COVID-19, public health, clean air, political self-determination, goods that we really can only enjoy in common rather than alone. So I think understanding the common good in terms of an ensemble of conditions that enable the flourishing of all rather than most. I think my students are good at most majoritarian conceptions, but really the flourishing of all. I think, though, responses to the pandemic have served to remind us of threats to the common good. Manipulative political rhetoric, the tribalization of partisanship, and our segmented social media feeds only complicate this shared task. Amid this wider cultural milieu, Catholic higher education also faces challenges. We face a utilitarian and careerist culture, beholden to accreditation standards, and we also are welcoming students, often formed more by technological habituation than by faith traditions, and who are swiftly saddled with debt. So, I would add intellectual mistrust of religious truth claims also persists among faculty members as well, often with good reason. I would say, there's a lot of theologians here, even in my own theology, in my own field, we have divisions between those who think the incorporation of intersectional methods are dangerous to theology and those who think it's pretty essential to the work that we do. So I think I'd like to suggest that engaging the idea of the common good across disciplines can counter isolating tendencies as well as refine these growing edges, these shortcomings, or these dimensions of the concept in need of renewal. So, I forgot to ask Jennifer. There we go. I'd like to just focus my comments on this practice of intellectual hospitality, which, like the happy hour setting, works quite well for, I think, and then kind of move into some conversation with you all. So attention to the Catholic intellectual tradition's growing edges can invite new stakeholders, I think, into dialogue about shared goods. So this praxis of intellectual hospitality perceives diversity not as a threat or an aberration to be tolerated, but a gift and expression of Catholicity. I think intellectual hospitality or interdisciplinary collaboration can also help theology guard against collapsing into ideologies that seek to tame the mystery, as Pope Francis has cautioned. I think his papacy, his kind of preference for a street-bound over a self-referential church, provides an apt orientation for intellectual hospitality. Oh, I should mention the image of him. This was from my previous university. Santa Clara had an alumni magazine dedicated to his encyclical Laudato Si. And I appreciated how they had an engineer, an environmental scientist, and a theologian kind of all reading the encyclical from their different disciplines. So I think amid an interdisciplinary community like we have in our universities, the idea of the common good can offer a promising site for this praxis. Employing the common good more as a lens than a fixed body of doctrine, I think it's well poised to orient our formation efforts across the university beyond just theology or campus ministry offerings alone. And engaging the concept in an effort to clarify competing values and engage fundamental questions can also help us get out of the silos that often frame our work in university settings. So, from the outset, I want to admit that the common good idea really swims against influential cultural tides influencing us, whether moral privatism, market fundamentalism, expressive individualism. I think each of these hardens resistance to common understandings of shared realities, much less shared goods. So I think our universities would do well to galvanize collaboration across disciplines to refine understandings and avoid blind spots. Pardon. The good life of the Aristotelian polis held appeal as long as you were not a woman or enslaved. So intentionally widening the conversation, I think, can alert Catholic intellectual communities to what common good talk obscures and whom it excludes. So, for example, dialogue between philosophy and theology and the social sciences can yield deeper understandings of the ways structures and cultures limit one's grasp and pursuit of shared goods. I think engaging the arts can alert us to the role that narratives or aesthetic experiences play in shaping our imagination around shared goods. Attention to insights from gender studies, which I think was over here, and to critical race theory can serve to interrogate the classical subject and shed light on whose equal rights remain unequally violated. So I think interdisciplinary exchange can illuminate the difficulties of articulating, of apprehending the common good, and in some powerful ways. Because I think even where in law or ostensible social consensus we affirm human dignity or the common good, we encounter those whose dignity is disproportionately endangered, whether in racialized incidents of police violence, repressive abuse of religious minorities, or pervasive exploitation of women. Causality is complex, but again, I think sometimes examining the classical subject or our conception of the good is important to uncover harmful assumptions. So dialogue with anthropology, sociology can help there. We talked at lunch today about the idea of the complementarity of the sexes that's often like lurking below Catholic family ethics, for instance, can bolster unequal burdens for care work, the work of social reproduction, with ontological status and with religious sanction. So I think an interdisciplinary approach to actual pressures facing families helps communities to better appreciate the violence, fragility, and cultural forces that directly impact families' lives. So the other thing I want to highlight is that our conceptions of the common good in our universities have not been immune to compromising legacies of enslavement and racial inequality. So interdisciplinary indicators invite us to historical truth-telling and anti-racist work within our institutions. I was hearing about two efforts here this weekend, I think. A Wabash grant, was that in just the theology department? And then, Laura, help me out. Yesterday you were talking about maybe a longer-term project of the sisters?
Yes. Well, there's a university becoming. Yeah,
Oh, I was thinking of the land-related project.
Oh, yes, kind of talking about land acknowledgement and then that we have boarding schools that have been a legacy here in the sisterhood, looking to begin conversations around reparations.
Exactly. Thank you. That's okay. No, I just think these institutional complicity questions, like send a louder message to our students no matter how great our lectures are in front of the classroom. So kind of seeing different universities, including this one, kind of looking into complicity in that way, I think is a great example. So findings from neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and moral psychology about the significant role of non-rational factors in understanding and pursuing goods, I think also suggests this interdisciplinary approach. I think if, as psychologist Jonathan Haidt has argued, that reason is at best riding the elephant of our emotions as we make judgments in conscience, then getting arguments about the common good right is not sufficient. So I think dialogue about how emotion, culture, imagination, and moral luck impact human discernment are really important for pursuit of the common good and student formation in particular. Jennifer, I'm just feeling like this is long. Are we doing okay if I make like 2 or 3 more points? I just feel like it's happy hour, and I want to move to the conversation. Keep going? Okay. Okay. Please read your boring statement to us. We're your people. Okay, I will carry on. It's just there's like wine and beer in eyesight. Okay, get up at any moment and I'll stick to the plans. No, I know. Ben's like, I'm sensing that you yourself, no, I'm good. Yeah, so I think the social sciences are pretty important too. Maybe to conclude, like, being upfront about the operations of power, structural violence, constructed identity, can really impact philosophical and theological models of moral agency. So I think this interdisciplinary exchange can help us see how dynamics, the complexities of pursuing the common good amid these dynamics that can harm but also really conceal. I mean, I do see this at work some places. Jennifer was just asking about our new core at Boston College. We have paired core courses across disciplines. I think that's great. I do, however, the last 20 years, often find students really struggling with significant cognitive dissonance across their classes and across our disciplines. Or I see kind of mission common good initiatives pitched unidirectionally and in predictable quarters, I guess. So this is kind of a hope to widen that. I think we, as educators, also face steep challenges in fostering contemplative attentiveness given our students' digital maximalism. This is such a depressing photo that I don't have attributed because I forget where I found it, but seeing a guy on his phone while the whale breached said so much when I came upon it. I think early in lockdown, when I was teaching online and homeschooling online and increasing my kids' screen time so they could socialize online, I started to appreciate how technology is also really an impediment to formation for the common good. I think the pursuit of a hyper-connected life not only drives students away from the solitude needed for reflection, but it also risks superficial engagement and isolation. Digital technologies often foster a sense of networked individualism rather than communities of social support. The constant interruption, the fact that mobile technology has made us all pausable, as Sherry Turkle puts it, leads to isolation from relationships and that spirit of absent presence. So I think education for the common good must contend with what it means to form a generation of students who have been absorbed by technology. Because for today's generation, beholden to this behavioral design marketing, which habituates retreat from primary texts that demand patient attentiveness, from genuine encounter, and into these alternate realities by unthinking choices, I think we're facing captivity in some sense. In October, I took my students out of our classroom on this short walk to Houghton Gardens, pictured here. Chris, did you ever go to Houghton Gardens? 0 of my students had ever heard of it. It's like a 9-minute walk from campus. And you can see I made them leave their backpacks and their devices and just walk around and tell me what they noticed. This was the first time I had seen my students' unmasked faces, but it was also this window into their overprogrammed lives. Like this 12-minute assignment was emotional for some of them. They just said, we're just so driven, we're so nonstop. I'm never just out in nature. I'm never not performing or doing something. And we were reading Laudato Si, the encyclical, so we could connect these rare contemplative opportunities to be attentive and to be open to wonder with habituating care for our common home. But I was kind of alarmed by how rare that opportunity was, or that invitation was, and for their reactions. I think if our campuses can work to cultivate interiority, our students will be more primed to seek the depth in ordinary interactions and resist the urge to fill every moment with a digitally mediated interaction. As Connor Kelly puts it, they might instead look beyond their screens and into the wonders of the world around them. I've been struck that not only in Laudato Si, but his more recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, that Pope Francis talks about the pursuit of actual rather than virtual relationships. So I don't know what your strategies are. I would welcome them. I think classroom technology policies or social media fasts, like meaningful co-curricular options for our students can help. So in some ways, that kind of transcendent orientation also has an opportunity in this interdisciplinary project. I think it can prove valuable rather than threatening. Climate change specialists, although I think you are an environmentalist, so you can correct me. I have read that climate change specialists have admitted that the planet's chief environmental problem may not be ecosystem collapse or biodiversity loss, but greed and apathy. And so those are problems that I think are relevant to spiritual transformation, and that climate science or policy paradigms, at least alone, are not as adequate to address. So I think, to go back to my other picture, that picture, that facing threats to our shared planet, our common home at a Catholic university can entail analyzing climate data, pursuing justice, but also evoking reverence. That's not ideal. I don't do that when teaching, don't worry. So in its summons to a far-reaching ecological conversion, Laudato Si highlights entrenched barriers to encountering the marginalized and the earth with compassion and justice. I was saying at a luncheon event earlier, I think throughout his papacy, Pope Francis has really underscored these harmful attitudes that harm people and planet alike. So he emphasizes not just policy choices or personal choices, but pervasive mindsets that shape our loyalties. So in Laudato Si, it's the technocratic paradigm that conditions lifestyles and social possibilities. He also talks about cheerful recklessness and anesthetizing consumerism. So countering unjust environmental practices and the lack of political will to reverse them, I think entails helping our students interrogate these totalizing worldviews that legitimate them. I think they function to perpetuate and also deny complicity in webs of injustice. So how we eat, how we waste, commute, vote, spend. But the encyclical's first and last words are not of doomsday, but hope in humans' capacities to enact positive change. I mean, he's unflinching in his prophetic critiques, including of the lack of political will, but the tone remains one of praise and humility. So I've been thinking here the last few days about how Benedictine values could offer similar resources for cultivating interiority and care for our common home. There's this image at the end of the encyclical where he talks about a sense of authentic humanity dwelling in the midst of this harmful culture, almost unnoticed, like a mist seeping beneath the door. I have 2 more points. How's our carrying capacity? Okay. Carrie Shane Davis is deciding for all of you, so you're on board. Okay. So I raise this just because I think barriers to pursuing the common good persist beyond our disciplinary silos, but cultural barriers, like those fostered by isolating technologies, are also complicating our task. So intellectual hospitality entails pretty challenging bridge building work, particularly when our institutions reward just staying in our lane. If we continue to go back to my original example, to fear the common good is either fascism or like an artifact to be preserved, then I think the need to be bilingual in our ability to speak both to the promise and the limits of our traditions remains urgent. So I just wanted to end with a couple of virtues to help universities in this task. The virtue of solidarity helps agents commit to the common good at every level in a persevering way. So beyond commitments to intellectual or institutional solidarities that I often hear emphasized in educational and policy settings, I wanted to briefly talk about incarnational solidarity and conflictual solidarity. Incarnational solidarity undertakes embodied practices of presence and service in the real world. It entails cultivating concrete, habitual ways of acknowledging our common humanity, as opposed to those cheap, virtual forms of solidarity proffered by a consumerist culture. Encounters by way of experience are frequently more likely, I think, to interrupt complacency and reform imagination than our abstract principles. Dean Brackley terms opportunities to act ourselves into new ways of thinking cognitive hygiene. He emphasizes the importance of engagement at the level of practice to adequately challenge intellectual and moral commitments. So I was hearing about the immersion trip to Jamaica, is that right? Or that's at St. John's? Bahamas. Shoot, I was thinking of somebody else that I met while here. To the Bahamas. So I think immersion, especially well-conceived immersion and well-conceived community-based learning classes, can help in this regard. But I think even more ordinary and episodic opportunities for this really abound. So I brought my students this semester to see a production of The Bluest Eye at a theater in downtown Boston over spring break. And it has continued to break open our texts and our course conversations like every week since they sacrificed their spring break night to come to the theater with their professor. I think student-led events, this is a mock border wall erected at Santa Clara when I worked there, or community events offer opportunities to kind of get out of our heads in our classrooms, and sometimes just risking incorporating dorm incidents or pushing beyond the culture of niceness that I think pervades a lot of our campuses offers opportunity. So another growing edge of the Catholic common good tradition relates to its tendency to prioritize unity, harmony, and synthesis in ways that totally avoid conflict. Some observers have characterized the encyclical tradition's actual development of solidarity as marked by caution at the service of safeguarding peace. So our colleague Brian Massengale employs the work of Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X as correctives to this tendency, noting that the African American tradition is always critical of solidarity without a social struggle. So he often says, in contrast to this dominant assumption that elites will just magically give up their privilege voluntarily, conflictual solidarity takes seriously how the virtue is lived in the midst of reality marked by social conflict and attuned to exploited subjects. Warnings that, in my view, warnings that social Catholicism underestimates the recalcitrance of the privileged and the power of the dispossessed are well taken. So he describes cross-racial solidarity as entailing lament, compassion, and transformative love to kind of break through these superficial palliatives. So just as one other example, at my last university at Santa Clara, we had permanent white crosses in the lawn in front of the mission chapel at the center of campus. So this was to evoke the memory of the Uka martyrs and the place of that in the school's memory and orientation. And passing that pretty much daily would always remind me of a visit by John Sobrino to campus commemorating the 20th anniversary of the martyrdom. And he lamented in his talk how difficult it is for universities to look at the world. He said, it's much easier for us to look at the moon. And he called us to take our scholarly competencies and fix our gaze upon the crucified persons of the world and bear a readiness to encounter life there. He said, life where it shouldn't be. So I think we might reflect on what it might mean to consider solidarity in costly ways, even if not entailing literal martyrdom. Because I think the commitment to the common good requires relinquishing power and privilege in ways that challenge the status quo. I was struck, I happen to have a couple of Minnesota Native undergraduates in my classes over the last 2 years. And especially the fall of 2020, I remember two sharing with me and their classmates their experiences at home after the murder of George Floyd. Some of them talked about conversations with their families at the dinner tables that they had never had before, that lockdown and the marches of that summer facilitated. And I think even if you just watched from afar, these marches with chanting and singing and marching face to face were a way that I think conflictual and this really embodied incarnational solidarity came together. I was struck by the effect that that had on these Minnesotans. So I think cultivating these conflictual and incarnational and intellectual solidarities can help our students to resist the harmful illusions of isolated living. An interdisciplinary engagement of the idea of the common good, I think, can counter forces that harden resistance to the shared goods on the one hand, but it can also invite new university stakeholders to contribute to formation for the common good on the other. So I would like to invite you just to take a couple of minutes and think back to why you got into this field to begin with. And it might be different from why you continue to do what you do today. You're not going to share this, you can be honest with yourselves. But I thought you could just take a minute or two to reflect on in what ways your research, your teaching, your admin labor serves the common good.
So I'm just welcome you. Are there any issues, questions that you'd like to kind of raise for our larger group and to Kristin that you've discussed? Challenges to the common good that you'd like to ask her about or just raise for us to listen to?
This isn't from our tape, but going back to your talk. So I was really struck by you opening up and saying that some of your theology colleagues see the common good as a kind of fascism. So I wanted to kind of go back to that. So are you saying then like the virtues of solidarity and the virtues of incarnational solidarity and conflictual solidarity are two ways to disrupt the possibility of the common good being fascistic? Or, I just was interested in some of that interplay.
Good question. That was kind of a strong program. It was actually a pedagogy group we were revamping our diversity core to become different justice on the common good. So it was an interdisciplinary group. I don't think there were any other theologians, so it was just interdisciplinary concepts. But I think that helpfully points to the suspicion in many cases well-founded of how these concepts can function. I think my hope here was more that the interdisciplinary collaboration, like intellectual hospitality, can disrupt that. I think what I mean by the growing edges, which I'll stop using as a euphemism, is to see like the blind spots or the shortcomings of a tradition that perhaps hasn't meant everyone when they claim universal values can be illuminated and reformed through interdisciplinary collaboration. So I think we shouldn't fear that engagement, including critique of Catholic concepts on Catholic campuses. And in many cases, if these are dynamic concepts, we in fact need other disciplines. Theology needs other disciplines to kind of point out those. Yeah, no, I meant more conflictual and incarnational solidarities as virtues for kind of helping cultivate that more amidst all these barriers, individualistic or technology.
They were the solution to the problem.
They were, but I clearly didn't have that out clearly enough. Yeah, so my point in opening there was just to say, and it was a seminar in which half of the group thought it was fascist, and the other half said, no, I have nothing to change on my syllabus. I don't care that it has 90 by 10 from Western Europe. I'm not going to change. So it was kind of a lonely semester for me, but I just, because I felt neither nor. But it points out, it overstates these kind of dual challenges, I think. Does that make more sense now?
Yeah.
Thanks, sure.
Can I follow up with because that whole individualism, I'm encountering that right now, because some of the work that I'm doing about trying to work with equity for students by making sure they're consistent. But
so like my
having
sister was 2 years
things,
old when she had
the
this,
students
so
that
she had
have
4
to make
kids and
perceive this as
because my sister was 2 and they were born. So she was like,
and how do you balance? Yes, I want to respect your individual rights, and at the same time, I want to make sure students have common that came out while you were talking about that's what you're doing, and you said fashion.
No, I just but it's not untrue. Yeah, so I might not be understanding exactly, Rich, but I do think this is a tradition that calls for a more robust meeting on needs, particularly for people who are most vulnerable, than like a flat equality, treat everybody the same, come what may. I think differentiating imputed equity from equality is important there, but also cousin of the common good in the Catholic social tradition is the option for the poor and vulnerable, but I too often hear it applied as the option for the innocent. So I don't know if that is a parallel with like academic freedom and straight equality, but that's in fact not the tradition. Or like a utilitarian calculus is not the same as the common good. So there's ways in which maybe that's more palatable in our rights-based individualistic culture that people drink in. But it's pretty different. It's pretty antithetical to this approach. Sounds like you're working to make this happen for students against various odds. So thank you.
How can you help students to see the difference, well, not the difference, but the importance of the common good versus the greater good? So I have students all the time that want to, like, okay, I can get to the greater good. Right, but I can't make that. The kind of most of them all.
Yeah.
Right, and so what are some ways that you help them or to see that?
Which makes me want to ask, sorry, I think
No.
it connects in.
Yeah.
Could you just define the common good since we're not all theologians?
Sure.
Because I think maybe you're assuming we all have a robust understanding of what that is, and my guess is we don't, and it's probably also contentious. So,
Yeah.
So maybe that would help you then to answer the common good versus the greater good and how it's different from utilitarianism.
Yeah, and I want to be careful because I know your learning goals that you send me also allow for, I don't have it in front of me, but multiple understandings, right, of the common good. So I was simply relying in the beginning on like the Catholic encyclical tradition of the conditions that allow for the flourishing of all members of a given community. And so I think Laura's saying students are much more comfortable often with like most or majoritarian. And I think some of that is like unmasking their attachment to meritocracy. When The Good Life was playing, the trolley problem was helpful. And kind of talking about sacrificing the vulnerable. But I just thought there's a big article critiquing ethics in The Good Life that I don't want to read. But anyway, I do think talking about what makes people more comfortable in our culture with the utilitarian mindset maybe is one way. which is hard because they're college students who worked really hard to get there. They almost need to believe in meritocracy, that it's not just something that they've imbibed. They have a stake. So when I talk about moral luck, that's not a comfortable conversation to have, people kind of examining on whose shoulders or with what privilege they've kind of arrived to where they are. I also teach, like you were saying, you do global health, public health, climate change, and
COVID.
I think I tend to also teach, I teach an AIDS class, I teach a lot about undocumented immigration, so we're typically covering material with vulnerable populations. And so I think the idea of sacrifice of the weak is a little harder to take if the whole focus of the course is populations who would be marginalized. But it's a challenge, I agree. Yeah, Jennifer.
Oh, I just wanted to mention, before I address the common good, I first have my students watch a cartoon, very 2-minute video on systemic racism. And it's just awesome because it has white boy, white girl, black boy, black girl, and they're all running a marathon. And then you watch, and it has no words, but it just brings, it has these, boulders and all of these barriers to the black kids first. And it just shows, and it has just words up of all of the barriers for them to get to win the marathon. And then at the very end, you have the white boy who has, they build this little track for him that's electronic, that gets him faster than the white girl, So it just to watch that first, to try to undercut the meritocracy and then introduce the idea of this, what would it be like to be in a community where you're just seeking to make sure that all persons have the minimal needs met to flourish. So I just think that's kind of helpful to do first.
Yeah, and I feel like there's bonding to a common floor on which people can stand much more than when I start speaking about a maximum living wage. So I think they're happier with equal access to opportunity than any sacrifice for goods for everyone. Yeah, but that sounds like a good illustration.
The lesson you gave us, I really like how alongside flourishing, you use survive and thrive. And when you introduce that idea of survival, I found that to be very helpful for students as they think about that.
Yeah.
So when the Catholic theologians use the term flourishing, what do you mean by that?
That's a great question.
And the reason I ask that, right, is because if you look at what happens with poverty rates, and this is even in the United States, where at least on the liberal side of things, we imagine that we have a very stingy social welfare program. But if you look at what happens to poverty rates with single mothers, children, starting with just the wages they earn. But then if you add in all the various kinds of government programs, in-kind transfers, medical benefits, and so forth that are made available, if they take advantage of it, the poverty rate is reduced by about 30-35%. Or it's a dramatic reduction. And so if we're looking at these kinds of situations where you have government programs that are through in-kind transfers are significantly reducing poverty rates, is that something that would count people who are benefited in that way? Does that count as a contribution to the common good or to flourishing? Or is there something more robust by the Catholic?
Yeah, I think, and there's other Catholic theologians in the room, you all chime in. I don't focus on flourishing, but I think it's more about agency and freedom than any kind of maximal outcome for everyone. So I see a lot of Catholic ethicists relying on philosopher Martha Nussbaum or the work of Amartya Sen, looking at just the need for development and the need for basic needs to be met. So I'm also in town for this immigration talk. The fact that without citizenship status, people in this country don't even have the right to have rights. So I don't think it's about what is your max or your minimum salary, so much as the ability to participate. I would say participation is really central to justice in the Catholic social tradition. The ability to contribute, I think this understanding of a labor that's about communication in wider society rather than just making ends meet. I think I see the social tradition more concerned with impediments to even engaging in the common good in terms of participation, development, voters' rights, citizenship status, the ability to work, than a flat maximum income or kind of calculation of material flourishing. Yeah, that's my initial response. What are your own thoughts?
I think a lot depends upon what we mean by participation and what a reasonable expectation is for an ordinary person to be able to participate in the life of a nation. And then what can reasonably be expected in terms of participation for people when we've got large movements of people across national borders so that you have large populations of non-citizens in various locations. What can reasonably be expected participation for such folks, right? Because how far we can get when we say that people who are, for whatever reason, migrants across borders and are not citizens of a nation, should they have equivalent participation rights with citizens of the nation? That's a hard one to answer. I have no idea how you address those kinds of questions.
I think the currents in the social tradition are to mitigate against taking those persons' labor, but not giving them a say in their representation or anything that all of our, like the claim rights that our tax dollars or citizenship status permit. So I see the tradition more curbing those shortcomings than articulating like a maximum living wage, which I shouldn't have said earlier either. That always gets my students pretty upset. Yeah. Like the philosopher Michael Walzer talking about membership as the primary good we distribute. I think, yeah, that gets us to a more communitarian approach where there really aren't participation rights for outsiders, just for insider members. I think that the Catholic social teaching approach would be a bit more cosmopolitan than that, even though, as you're indicating, it's kind of complicated.
Well, thank you so much, Kristin, and I need to let you all go.
I know, thanks for sitting.
A long time, so thank you so much.